Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Whitney. Thank you for coming out on this snowy night for what is sure to be an amazing evening. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney Museum. Thanks. And it's my distinct privilege to introduce tonight's program. An evening of reflections on Lyle Ashton Harris's monumental Ektachrome Archive. With the publication of Today, I Shall Judge Nothing That Occurs, Lyle's archive takes new form as an absolutely stunning book published by Aperture. This volume intersperses photographs and other materials from the archive with newly commissioned texts by artists and writers, revealing in unique, often very personal ways, the multiple meanings and deep significance of Lyle's project. And if you don't yet have one, we have signed copies available outside the theater, available for purchase after the program. Lyle Ashton Harris has a long history with the Whitney Museum, a history that is made visible in the Ektachrome Archive. His work was included in the landmark exhibition Black Male, curated by Thelma Golden at the Whitney in 1994. Lyle's photographs of the opening of that exhibition are part of the archive, where their inclusion alongside images of the Black Popular Culture Conference in 1991, the Truce Between the Crips and the Bloods in 1992, and the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference in 1995 gives Black Male indispensable historical and social context. We were fortunate to include Lyle's Once, Now, Again in the 2017 Whitney Biennial, a site-specific multimedia installation. It features a 3-channel video work comprised of projected images taken from the Ektachrome Archive, as well as 3 new video works composed of footage originally recorded in the 1990s. And we are so proud that the Ektachrome Archive has just entered the Whitney's permanent collection. Yeah! I want to acknowledge everyone who has supported this project and Lyle's work over the years. We are so glad that so many of you could be here. In particular, I have to say thank you to Aperture for collaborating with us on this program, especially Leslie Martin and Emily Stewart. Yay! Thank you to the speakers for sharing your thoughts and experiences with the history that Lyle's archive embodies. I'm especially grateful to my colleague, Chris Liu, for his invaluable collaboration on tonight's program. And finally, Lyle, thank you for this incredible work and for sharing it with us. I'm going to read more bios. I have to read everyone's bio. Don't get up yet. In the interest of time, and to keep us moving, I'm going to briefly introduce each of the speakers tonight in the order that they will be speaking in, and then I'm going to turn things over to Lyle. He's really eager to be with you. Robert Reid-Pharr is a professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center, where he teaches and writes on African American literature and queer theory. His most recent book is Once You Go Black, Choice, Desire, and the Black American Intellectual, a study of African American culture and intellectual history in the late 20th century America. Johanna Burton is an art historian, critic, and curator. She currently works as the Keith Haring Director and Curator of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum in New York, and the series editor for the museum's, she is the series editor for the museum's critical anthologies in art and culture. Her exhibition, Trigger, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon, is on view at the New Museum through the end of January, right? Okay. Ike Ude is a Nigerian-born, New York-based artist conversant with the world of fashion and celebrity. In his work, Ude plays with the ambiguities of the marketplace and art world, particularly in his seminal art, culture, and fashion magazine, Arude, and recently his style blog, The Chic Index. Catherine Lord is an artist and writer who divides her time between Hudson and Manhattan. She was Dean of the School of Arts at CalArts during the 1980s and is the author of The Summer of Her Baldness, A Cancer Improvisation, and with Richard Meyer, The Survey, Art, and Queer Culture. She is Professor Emerita of Studio Art at the University of California, Irvine. Kimberly Drew, aka Museum Mammy, as a writer, curator, and activist with a passion for innovation in art, fashion, and cultural studies. An avid proponent of Black spaces, Drew first experienced the art world as an intern in the director's office at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She is currently the social media manager at the Met. Christopher Y. Liu is the Nancy and Fred Poses Associate Curator at the Whitney. With Mia Locks, he co-curated the 2017 Whitney Biennial. Greg Bordowitz is an artist, writer, and the director of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago Low Residency MFA program. Currently, he has work in the Trigger exhibition at the New Museum and will be performing new talks titled Some Styles of Masculinity there in January 19th, 20th, and 21st. His work was included in the 1995 Whitney Biennial, and he is faculty at the Whitney's Independent Study Program. Micheline Thomas is a visual artist, filmmaker, and curator whose work has been exhibited extensively, both nationally and internationally. She is known for paintings that combine art historical, political, and pop cultural references. Her work introduces complex notions of femininity and challenges common definitions of beauty and aesthetic representations of women. And her work is in the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum. I had to do that, sorry. And finally, Jason Moran is a jazz pianist, composer, and performance artist. He was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2010. Moran has a long-standing collaborative practice with his wife, the singer and Broadway actress Alicia Hall Moran. Their work Bleed was a highlight of the 2012 Whitney Biennial. And Moran, Jason, I didn't check this with you, but I read that you'll have your first solo museum exhibition at the Walker Arts Center in the spring of 2018. I hope that's correct. So exciting. So without further ado, thank you all so much for being here. And Lyle, it's all you.
Can I be heard? Okay. I'm just going to pull this back a little bit. Well, welcome. Thanks, everyone, for coming out on the snowy night. I did not know the weather report, but I'm grateful everyone's here this evening. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was on vacation in St. Martin's and attending a recovery meeting, AA. While I was there, which I often do on vacation, and someone at the meeting mentioned the importance of gratitudes, and they were saying a way to get balance, if you will, was to do maybe 50 gratitudes. I was like, can I do 50 gratitudes? Well, I wound up doing 74 at dinner afterwards, and I'm sharing that with you because I was instructed by Chris and Megan not to take you emotionally hostage today, but it is important that I do express my gratitude, and I would like to dedicate this evening to the memory of Marlon Riggs, Essex Hemphill, and Stuart Hall. Ashe. I would like to give thanks to all those who consented to be photographed and appear in the book, which now connects them all to one another, to us, through the presence of their image in the archive. I would like to thank our host this evening, Whitney Director Adam Weinberg, Whitney's Curator of Education, Megan, and Aperture's Emily Stewart for coordinating this lovely event. And I just want to say a special word to thank Megan for a conversation we had in my studio, which allowed for this legacy to continue on. So I want to personally thank you for that and respect the amazing work you're doing here. I'd like to thank Chris Liu and Mia Locks, the curator of the Whitney's Biennial. And Elizabeth Sussman for overseeing the acquisition of the Ektachrome Archive by the Whitney. My heartfelt thanks goes to those of who contributed, whose contributions appear in this monograph. So it's going to be a listing of names, but I think it's important to, let's say, name us, name them, name us. Vince Aletti, Martina Attil, Uli Beer, Greg Bordowitz, the text editor, Joanna Burton, who we fought many times and really distilled this book to where it is today. I'm deeply grateful. Adrian Edwards, Malik Gaines, Lucia Galan, my brother Thomas Allen Harris, Rashid Johnson, Thomas Lax, my studio manager, lead archive researcher, and dear friend Parissa Lynn, who is the voice of the future I remember reading that the beautiful ones haven't been born, but I would say that the heart of this archive is about speaking to this next generation that I'm deeply inspired for, and she is exemplary of this next generation, so I want to acknowledge her. Sarah Lewis, my dear friend Kathleen Lord, who spotted me out when I was selected to go take beautiful photographs by Art Center. She selected me to go to Cal Arts, and she was my dean and gave me a new vision, allowed me to be where I am today. Roxana McCochie, Pamela Newkirk, Clarence Otis Jr., Robert Reid-Pharr, Robert Stewart, Micheline Thomas, and my dear brother, Ike Uday. So thank you. In addition, I would like to thank Kimberly Drew and Jason Moran. So grateful that you're joining us this evening here to extend and to expand the arc of the archive. A deep thanks goes to creative director Leslie Martin of Aperture, whose keen eye and fierce passion proved invaluable, and to Chris Boot, the director of Aperture, as well as the amazing Aperture team. My work would not be possible without the sustained support and love of long-standing patrons. For that, I'm deeply grateful, and for the friendship of Aggie Gunn, Mi-Young Lee, Neil Simpkin, Jackie Bradley, Clarence Otis Jr., Greg Miller, and Michael Wiener. I wish to express special appreciation to the many supporters and friends who made this book possible. Carmine Bacucci and Bernard Lumpkin, Katie and Jim Brennan, David Castillo, Andrew Craven, Dawn Davis, Jeannie Greenberg, Beth the Woody, Faraz the Haid, Alex Farrow, Alex Hall, Jim Hodges, Michael Ho, Robert Holmes, Noel Kanan, Richard Shabiro, and Whitney trustee Ann Temkin and her husband, Thomas Lee. And when all is said and done, my lifelong gratitude goes to my dear friend Tommy Gear and my mother, Rudine Lee Nyan, who are here with us this evening. So how are we doing in terms of my time? You said I had 10, because I just want to give a brief, how am I doing? 5? I won't take 5, but I just want to, just say I was supposed to talk about the brief history of the archive, but I think it was important to really talk about, those that in the room and out of the rooms in the book that not only made this archive possible, the book possible, but also helped to sustain me as a human. And but I want to just give a few brief dates. As many of you know, I was living in Ghana 2005 to 2012, but I'll back up. In 2000, I received a Prix de Rome, which I packed my whole studio up and put in storage with the exception of 35 millimeter Ektachrome slides. And I deposited in the safe bosom of my mother's home, knowing that had not only a physical but also a spiritual guidance, if you will, and protection. And it wasn't until several years later, upon returning from Ghana after getting out of the grieving over a 7-year monogamous relationship with Prince Martha in Ghana, that I returned, that my good friend Isaac Julian got in contact with. We had been estranged for a while. They got in contact with me to ask me to use some of my snapshots to illustrate his upcoming book for his catalog book, monograph, I should say, that was on the occasion of his show, 10,000 Waves at the Modern. And so I had a couple of assistants go up to my mother's home and to retrieve these slides. And so I think it was at that moment that I had an encounter with the past, and I love Ghana, but there was something formal about the culture, and there was something about reconnecting with the urgency and the passion and the punkishness, if you will, of the archive that allowed me to get back to the pulse of New York, if you will. And so for the next couple of years, we sorted the images. I got invited to go up to Yale. Gregor Crutzen and Rob Stewart invited me up to show images up there. The students didn't give a F about the content, but the visual narrative, they got it. But a few months later, the legendary Carrie Williams invited me to show some slides at her seminal Carrie Williams Live at the Guggenheim, and it was there that Jason saw that performance, and it was Elizabeth Alexander. It was different from Yale, where people in the cribs are not born yet, but at the Guggenheim, people had been lived in a particular period. So there's a different relationship to the archive of grieving and mourning and celebration, and that told me something. What does it mean for one archive, one body, to be able to have radically different, somehow, responses, but equally rich and equally important? So to speed up, South Africa, I was sharing it there. I was at a residency, and someone came in who was a colleague of, former colleague of the former president, Mbeki, and he could identify many people in the archive. So what did it mean to have to go to South Africa or London to be able to have people resonate? So that told me something. So during South Africa, I met Gabby and Yoko, who invited me to take part in Sao Paulo Biennial. And then Chris, who had also was at the Guggenheim Live, he piqued his interest, and we began a friendship while he was working at PS1 MoMA. It was through a show that he curated of Cliff Owens at PS1 MoMA Cliff was doing, staging one of the scores on me and my work, that Chris and I began our dialogue. And I deeply respect him because it was Chris who was able to somehow help me to excavate or to somehow pull out those moments which were difficult for me to actually encounter in the past, if you will. So hence, he and Mia Young curated me into the Venice Biennale, and the rest is history. So I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to turn it over. Again, I'm not supposed to be doing emotional heavy lifting. I'm going to the beach. I'm scheduled to leave tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., but I'm so happy to be here tonight. So thank you. And the warm climate, honey. So let it begin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Reid-Pharr. I have to say that one of my huge rules in life is never follow the diva. You want to lead up to the diva, you know. But I'm going to try to do the best I can do. I can't see you, but I'm certain that you're beautiful in the darkness. We've been told strictly to stay within 5 to 7 minutes or things will happen. And so I've timed myself. I'm going to take 6 minutes. The truth of the matter is that I found writing the essay that I produced for Today I Shall Judge Nothing That Occurs quite difficult. As a writer, I depend mightily on my instincts about mood and rhythm when I'm beginning a piece. I frequently know exactly what I want to say, but I almost always know what the meter and feel of the work should be as I place my fingers to the keyboard. Still, something about the photographs within Lyle Harris's Ektachrome Archive eluded me. I could see their often lush beauty. I recognized the ways in which they documented the messy interrelation between the personal and the private, affect and politics, but I could not easily hear them. I couldn't catch the style of address for which they called. Lyle said to me, after reading a first draft of my essay, something like, "I want more anger, less professorial exegesis. I want you to speak the truth of this person," flashing an image of a 20-something version of me, hugging filmmaker Shoal Dunye, eyes glassy and reefer red. I thought, good Lord, how could I have ever possibly have allowed this picture to be taken? The thing is that I love that boy. I love how promising and valiant and persevering he was. But in actual fact, I do not miss him. Or perhaps it is better to say, I do not miss the fear, the hurt, the claustrophobic uncertainty. The images in the archive of Essex and Marlon and Stewart and the many others who have been lost are remarkably compelling to me. They make my heart skip. They disturb a wound that has never properly healed. But as a matter of survival, I avoid nostalgia and melancholia. I frankly believe, moreover, that pessimism is a mood that I cannot afford, that our generations cannot afford. Here then is the rub. I am, in fact, something like a cultural historian. I spend my days in archives recreating and repurposing old, sometimes ancient narratives. I understood from the very first moment of looking at the images in Today I Shall Judge Nothing That Occurs, that what I was witnessing was a record of us looking at us coming to understand ourselves as a newly emergent class of artists, activists, intellectuals. We made new forms of family and community, and Lyle, among many others, documented that process. The thing that I continually forced myself to remember, however, while I was thinking about the Ektachrome Archive, was that I needed to avoid attempting to recapture the voice of the young man whose crimson eyes look back at me with so much hope and fear. Instead, as a political act, indeed an act of optimism, I needed to remember that the man writing the words that appear in this wonderful collection of photos and essays, the man standing before you now, is in fact 52, weight-obsessed, neat, cerebral, hotly angry, but I hope in no way bitter. He is a man who remembers the most basic beliefs of our people. Keep it moving, let it go. Today is for the living, eyes on the prize. I wanted, that is, to avoid the trap of allowing myself to believe that my own fantasy, my own remembrance of youth is a fantasy that applies to everyone everywhere. I wanted to make space to anticipate my own impending departure, my maturity, and my dotage. I wanted to allow the many images of myself that I will leave behind to rest in their own awkward, not quite hearable rhythms. I don't want America to be great again. I don't want to go back to a gallant past. Things were not better then. I don't yearn for the glory days of the 80s and 90s. I believe instead that it is good that times change. It is good that I continue to be confused. It is good that I can look at images of my own cherished past and find it difficult to hear them. It took me a while to understand the beauty of Today I Shall Judge Nothing That Occurs. It took me many difficult moments to recognize how uncomfortable this archive makes me feel, how out of step. I think that's why I can't stop looking at the images. It is rare that I feel stumped, rare that I have a sense that change has happened, is happening all around me in rhythms that I cannot catch, but that nonetheless make me hopeful and committed in ways that are promising and new and messy and gallant, but that I nonetheless cannot fully understand. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lyle.
Hello, everybody, and thank you. This feels like a really important event. Lyle, wherever you are, there you are. I first met Lyle in the mid-1990s when I was an unlikely art history undergraduate at a state school in Reno, Nevada. I met Lyle through Thelma Golden, who I also actually didn't know. Researching exhibitions and artists that addressed identity, I ran forcefully into blackmail. And like so many other early epiphantic scenes that I experienced during those early years of my own formation, I found myself in relation to, even having relationships with, people and practices who themselves knew nothing of our sudden bonds. In case that's unclear, I didn't actually meet Lyle in the 1990s. Rather than describing these events as one-way streets, though, I would insist they are love stories, or at least stories of desire. In the late 1990s, when I moved to New York, in part to meet the people that I already had phantasmatic conversations with in my head, I had inherited not only an arsenal of histories that were not mine, but nonetheless propelled me into the future I am now living, but also a slew of theory that was beginning to debate the effectual aspects of knowledge. Jane Gallup famously put forward around that time an ostensibly metaphoric model derived from psychoanalytic theory, that of seduction, borrowed, of course, from Freud. Learning felt that way to me. Every new argument was equally compelling. I swooned to all of them. A side note that, as we are seeing today, metaphors often give way to the literal, and Gallup herself was accused of sexual harassment not long after this book was published. I was asked today to address the following question. How does the archive speak to contemporary political and social concerns? How does a body of work serve to document differences or continuities between the period it addresses, the late 80s to the early 2000s, and now? I'm not sure an archive can speak to contemporary political and social concerns, nor that it serves to document the parallels or breaks between a past and a present. Lyle's archive, in particular, seems to me to undermine the very concept of a smooth transition or set of coordinates between time periods, even as it eschews the notion of an era altogether. I come to this project with a particular lens, having worked with and edited most of the singular texts reflecting on reflections taking up the archive. I could never have anticipated the radically divergent responses that met the archive, marking terrain between what is and how it is seen, how it is read. What is true is that everyone looking at the archive wants something from it. This is one way to describe desire, a longing. But wanting something is also a demand. People want to find in records of the past something that roots them or holds them somewhere they've been or they want to place themselves, even if in absentia. Leaving aside for a moment the love stories with which I began, I want to ask, what is it we want from Lyle's archive in asking it to speak to today's much changed, if no less complex context? I partially ask this question because there's such a desire to go back to this period. I'm happy to go right after Robert in this way, as though it was a time period that we should return to. And I'm curious in bringing these images forward how we're approaching them. The primal scenes in the archive are clearly articulated, if rarely photographed straight on. An emerging collective drive toward work that addressed a post-colonial context in the art world and well beyond, in the Black Popular Culture Conference, in Black Male, the intersection of pre- and post-AIDS erotics, and with it the loss not only of lives but of critical mass. The messy politics of parallel lines of demand, multiculturalism, feminism, direct activism, the demand for representation, the refusal of representation. What we want from Lyle's archive and what we get are distinct. If we look to it as a manual for today, we miss the opportunity to really see the past for what it was and what it is. I only really got to meet the Lyle of 1989, of 1997, of 2000 during the making of this book, meeting his younger selves along the way. Which is to say, I have never met those younger selves, and yet I know them. As we engage today in increasingly complex and urgent dialogues about how and whether new, long overdue modes of ethical entanglement are possible, it seems crucial to consider how repressed or alternative histories reroute what we think we know, rather than being absorbed by it. In the short time I had today, I simply wanted to point to the notion of desire and how it too changes under pressure and within context. Desire as igniting and expansive, and desire as unrelenting and invasive. Somewhere, somehow, any recall of the past conjures both aspects. So where does Lyle's archive sit in relationship both to its own time and our own? Uneasily, thank God.
Hello. Good evening. Much of what I want to say tonight is quite embedded in my text. Needless to say, my friendship and relationship, as it were, with Lyle is quite profound and ineffable. So, indulge me. The title of my essay on Lyle is called The Quotidian and Precious Moments. The ticking away of time is a constant, eternal, merciless, immoral, sometimes the passing of precious moments is preciously captured, but this seems to be the case less than often. How time has passed since Lyle and I were inseparable. We were once, literally speaking, soul brothers who connected beautifully in ways that were truly rare. This was in the 1990s. Lyle, American-born and bred, I, Nigerian-born and bred, were both New Yorkers and Africans in equal measure and sympathies. And from the get-go, Lyle was on a mission fueled by an insatiable, flame-like passion. He took on that mission and passion with knowing casualness, very key, and applied a casual rigor to the documentary impulse. Lyle's method became a potent, transgressive act of interrogation that in effect interrogated the relatively conservative history of Black/African representation at large. Pouring through some of his snapshots of yesteryear startled me with their ghostly presence and acknowledgement of time past, of lost youth, of youthful beauty, once bountiful, elastic, and full of vigor. And as important is the how Lyle elected to use his camera as a mode of intervention, inquiry, investigation, to make pictures that are question marks, fruitful, fill in the blanks, etc. He was able to delightfully, even mischievously, undermine the starchy conservatism characteristic of representing of our folks in general. By turns furtive, casual, a shade mean, judicious, calculative, poignant, poetic, sly, and charming, Lyle whipped out his camera to get these images. The narrowed gaze, the hawkish look in his eyes tracks and locks a subject, or victim if you like. Camera already cupped in hand, he fires away and then resumes altogether or changes the conversation from the profound to the blah, 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 but without knowing satisfaction of what his camera has captured. I was keenly aware that everyone was subject to Lyle's insatiable, wicked, transgressive lens. Did he not capture bare hooks, moisturizing or drying her smooth body in the privacy of a bathroom, but with a door considerably ajar? Totally nude, but not naked. This photograph caused, without exaggeration, a profound stir amongst the literati from New York to London and Los Angeles. As a result, Lyle was temporarily excommunicated. He was near a pariah status, but I relished this rebelliousness and deviancy with total sympathy. In turn, he was at my side when at a party hosted by Manthia Diawara in honor of legendary Senegalese filmmaker, Ousmane Sembène, I mischievously and gamely asked the filmmaker the color of his underwear. When an interpreter, because he spoke French, when an interpreter finally told Sembène what my question was, he erupted, rose and punched me, and geared for more fight. Lyle and I forthwith left the party in rapturous fits of laughter that hurt pleasantly. Did I not see him capture many a folk dozing off, their mouths ajar and looking like shadows of their waking selves? These are perhaps examples of perfectly inspired mischief, curious voyeurisms, anxious sympathy, and charming cruelty. Because he's a visual diarist, Lyle's snapshots have the charmed linguistic economy of haikus. They are, by turns, observed, reflexive, impulsive, deliberated quotidian moments, pregnant with meanings, with question marks, open to interpretations, yet perpetually deferred conclusions.
Hi there. I was asked to think about, or I volunteered to think for some insane reason about the archive and collective memory. And then I doodled, so I will just read following the diva. Both the archive and collective memory are fictions, strategic fictions to be sure, but nonetheless the sort of frayed holdalls, bulging plumber's bags that are forever fragmenting, rusting, disintegrating, being consumed by vermin, human and otherwise, thrown into the garbage, misconstrued, contested, and so forth. The highly edited narrative series presented as Lyle's Ektachrome Archive, definitively exiled to the past because its material base is now outmoded, and no one does E4 processing these days because it is way too toxic. Lyle's Ektachrome Archive is autobiography choreographed by editing. It's not a raw pile of stuff, but a story Lyle has extracted from a pile of stuff. Part of that autobiography I propose, and thus part of the archive, a storage box inflated to architectural scale, is that Lyle has a mother who lived in a part of North America where people had basements, and who was stable enough in her relationship to basements that she could let Lyle store his stuff while he was going through his particular nomadism of lovers, practices, residencies, HIV status, substances, temporary enthusiasms, and medical interventions. There are parts of Lyle's life that I know nothing about, but I know that the Ektachrome Archive was conserved through a mother's cooperation. I bring this up because mothers don't generally figure in theoretical discussions of the archive or archive fever, which famously was first described as a symptom of the patriarchy. Thank you, Rudine. What we have really is an autobiography ghostwritten by an archive. We have a finished story, not raw material, a coming of age and passing to aging tale conducted and collaged through the medium of a toxic technology. Somehow that fits. Never get too comfy with the idea of memory, much less collective memory. The collective to which this archive is addressed, before everyone in it dies and before the documents which affect us are examined by curious historians so far in the future that those who will be responsible for their embryonic existence haven't yet amassed the currency to save up for their in vitro procedures. A large part of the collective to which this archive is addressed is presumably sitting in this room. We still mourn the same dead, but we don't necessarily know each other or even remember each other when we see each other. Yet Lyle's edited Ektachrome Archive calls us into being as a collective and holds us together as a collective. We are interpolated into existence or into the adjacent theory by the idea of the archive that Lyle dangles before us. What used to be a family, and then what became the queer family, has turned into a manifesto and something of a proffer. The archive is a charmer and a tease, rather like Lyle. Archive fever runs high. You will be wealthy one day. That's what Lyle's Aunt Shirley said. I am, according to my wife, a contrarian. I prefer... It's so much more complicated than that. Every word in that sentence is so much more complicated than that. I prefer to think of myself as a little fish. I'm honored to swim at the edge of the big Ektachrome pond with those more distinguished than I, but I don't want to be drowned in the collective that it asserts. I can perfectly well see that the book will be a prompt for future artists and historians who will turn the photographs into evidence of something they cannot remember and already believe. But at the moment, I'm interested in my place at the margin of this archive, my foothold in someone else's paradise. There are things that remain outside the archive, memory, for example, which no archive actually houses. When I look at the story Lyle tells about himself, I see past the tangled, rich, liberatory paths of the 80s and 90s to the bare fact of our parallel aging in our different bodies. This may seem trivial or vain in relation to Lyle's narrative, but every time I open the book, I launch myself into a scrutiny of his aging. As I'm almost 20 years older than Lyle, sometimes that's hilarious, sometimes that's pathetic. And our molecules have replaced themselves many times over. But it is true that I find and register my own scars by picking apart the aging of the body of someone I met as a very wide-eyed, very young man. It's the particularly beautiful form of fag-haggery. Thank you, Reid-Pharr. Thank you, Aunt Shirley. Thank you, Lyle.
Hello. Hi. I'm Kimberly. I almost don't even feel like, I don't know, just sitting here, I'm thinking so much about my extreme gratitude for my friendship with Lyle, and that I'm even allowed to stand here right now. So I guess first I want to start with a thank you to you, Lyle, for this opportunity, and then also for the way in which these images came into my life, and thinking about, especially being like the young person, and looking into these images and seeing these people who I know to be my heroes because I came in later, right? And seeing the messiness, seeing the grittiness, seeing the truth in these images, and understanding that it gives us permission to be messy too. It gives us permission to hold on to ourselves in a different way. And so I come to this discussion with the little bit of time that we have with more questions than answers or essays, because I'm not really an essayist. So my 10 questions. What does the archive hold? What does the archive hide? How messy is the archive? What does the archive disrupt? What is too strange for the archive? What is too small for the archive? What is too big for the archive? How violent is the archive? Who gives a fuck about the archive? And what exactly does the archive celebrate? And because I am a sentimentalist and not anything other than that, I also wanted to just read one of my favorite poems because I'm an internet kid, and I think that internet things are fun. And in my last question, what does the archive celebrate, made me think of Lucille Clifton's poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? So I'm going to read that, if you'll allow me. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Thank you, Lyle.
Hello. I'm going to pick up a little bit of the story where Lyle left off for some things. I first learned of Lyle's Ektachrome Archive in spring of 2014 during the symposium that Lyle mentioned around Carrie Mae Weems and her retrospective at the Guggenheim. For Lyle's contribution, he presented a slideshow of images from the archive. At that time, he already set it to the Grace Jones soundtrack, which we heard a little bit of, and Lyle said little to describe the images that flashed on screen. He'd identify a person now and then, Marlon Riggs, Stuart Hall, Bell Hooks, others. And whether or not he mentioned someone's name, there were collective gasps in the room, nearly with every image. Seated in the audience, I could feel the collective recognition of specific individuals, specific places and times from 20 to 30 years ago. It was likely that many in the audience were there with Lyle, at the opening of Black Male or attending the Black Popular Culture Conference. You could feel the spark of memory in the room. And for those of us who were not there in person, myself included, it was as if though Lyle's photographs served not as a document of the past, but rather it brought us into those moments, evoking the sweat and drama of each event. And with this first taste of the archive, my curatorial radar went off. I had a hunch that there was more to delve into. There was something beyond just the pictures that Lyle showed in rapid succession. And so at that point, I pretty much just started stalking him. So I did a studio visit. Lyle walked me through the photographs, speaking rapidly about the individuals depicted, where they were taken, when. And he said that there was more, that not just photos, but he had videos, he had journals, and that really piqued my interest. I was imagining all these moving pictures, text, and I said I'd come back to see as much as possible. And at that time, I think my interest was more of an annoyance to him than anything else, because that meant for him that he had to catalog hours and hours of footage, transfer old tapes onto hard drives, dust off journals, organize them. And at that stage, he wasn't sure how it all would come together. But since that unknown kind of made me want to learn more, to keep following and see where the work would ultimately develop. And since he was thinking of the archive as a kind of raw material and not just as a time capsule, I knew that it would grow into something that I couldn't fully anticipate, some kind of bridge from a 21st century perspective in which he held at that moment kind of more like today, and then bridging back to the 90s. And so every few months I would drop in to see what was going on. I would throw out different ideas, not so much with the aim to kind of direct the project or to kind of fully influence Lyle's thinking, but just to keep the thinking process as open as possible. I would ask things like, is the physical photograph important, or is it just the image? Can a rhythm be established between the kind of more meditative images and the energetic ones? And can the videos be in dialogue with the photographs? And then more conceptual things. What did it mean to mine one's own archive, one's own image? When I learned Lyle was invited to show the archive as part of the Sao Paulo Biennial, I had a twinge of jealousy, I have to admit. It meant that Joaquin Volz, the curator of the biennial, would then get to do the meaty conversation, to really dig in deep with him. But I'd still drop into the studio every time and again just to see what was going on for my own curiosity. I was kind of the curatorial mistress on the side, and I was okay with that. But luckily, then the Whitney Biennial came about, and so Mia Locks and I had the opportunity then to work with Lyle and to kind of work with him on its installation in New York. And I'm just super grateful for that, and just want to thank Lyle for letting me be part of this journey with him along the way with the archive.
Hi, I'm Greg. Hey. Thank you, Lyle, so much, and congratulations on a beautiful book and a truly significant accomplishment. I'm honored to have written something for the book and honored to be here as well. Thank you to Johanna, who first extended the invitation to me to write for the book, and thank you for having me. I'm very grateful. I didn't write anything. I just had this bunch of notes that I wrote a bit earlier, and I'm just going to go through them. I chose to answer some questions that were posed to us. I'm going to focus on how do you engage with the legacy of the Black Popular Culture Conference of 1991. I will do that. I was there, and I will talk a little bit about that, and reflect on the legacy of the HIV crisis of the 90s, which I find strange because for me, it's the 80s. There was no 90s for me. It was just the long 80s. And I know sometimes I think I'm still in it. So with all due respect, I love Robert Reid-Pharr, but I'm in a throuple with nostalgia and melancholy, and you can call me depression. I've tried to elevate it to a high style, actually. I try to wear it well. And in doing so, I'm going to actually talk about some things in the 90s, I'll say the 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, which may sound strange to our ears now, but go to the issue of the structure of feeling. Raymond Williams, the great Welsh sociologist who was a fellow traveler and colleague of Stuart Hall's, and who established cultural studies along with Stuart Hall and a few others. Raymond Williams identified something called the structure of feeling, which you can't really identify in the moment. It usually takes, he gave it a quantity. He says it usually takes about a decade or 15 years before you can actually identify the structure of feeling in a moment, particularly in a work of art. And I think Lyle's Ektachrome project actually gives us that opportunity. And by structure of feeling, Williams actually meant the cut of the cloth, the style of the hair, the composure of the pose before the gaze of the camera. All of these things were subject to what Stuart Hall would call a conjuncture, which is a meeting of historical forces. And if there is one word that emanates from that moment forward, that carries forward our relationship to that moment in the 90s and this moment now, it is intersectionality. This is what we see in the Ektachrome project, intersectionality. This was what was on our minds at the time, and we had a different language for it. And I wonder if that language holds up. So, and by way of talking about structure of feeling, I'm just going to go through some reminiscences. So if you went to the Lesbian and Gay Center, it was only called the Lesbian and Gay Center, the B and the T and the Q hadn't arrived yet. And which is only on 13th Street, a few blocks away from here. You went to the Lesbian and Gay Center. There was always a chalkboard, and on the chalkboard there was where the rooms were that certain meetings were happening. So their ACT UP was on the ground floor, and Other Countries was on the second floor, and then there was an AA meeting always somewhere in the back, and then there was Black and White Men Together. Does anyone remember that group? Black and White Men Together. Black and White Men Together was a group of black and white men who were interested in each other and were there to talk about it. How it happened, but more precisely, how it could happen. There was a large subset of that group which could have more properly been called Black and Jewish men. And I don't know how we would translate that now, actually. Like, what would we say? People who appear to be male, who appear to be black, who may or may not identify as either or both, with people who appear to be male and may identify as such, who have either been fooled into thinking or actually believe that they're white. That is somehow the trajectory of the complexity of the conversation that we have had in this interim of time. There was also this group, I just have to say, there was also this group I love, Mirth and Girth. Remember Mirth and Girth? Mirth and Girth was really heavy men, Girth, who were really into really skinny men, Mirth, right? And they were there to seek each other out and talk about it. And now these groups don't exist anymore, or I'm not invited, or I'm older, and but what's interesting to me is that at that specificity, with that kind of lineage, what we were trying to carry forward during the worst moment of the AIDS crisis in New York City was the trajectory of sexual liberation as it was defined by the lesbian and gay queer movement. And so honest, frank discussion about identity and how we appear to each other in the context of a conversation about desire and how it complicates and is complicated, and how a race or an ethnicity or a size could actually be a term of desire, which I feel is not something we can talk about now. And maybe there's a good reason for that. I don't know. But I think it's interesting to note that that was one structure of feeling at the time, that it felt progressive and righteous and right on to be able to discuss those things in 1991. And in 1991, in 1989, that's the year that Tongues Untied came out, a film by Marlon Riggs, which I always ask my students, have you seen Tongues Untied? And I am always brought to tears by the number of people who have not seen Tongues Untied, and why, I ask myself, why is that not in the canon? Why? Of course, it shows many places, but why is it not better known? Marlon and I showed our films together. I've thought a lot about that film. I was asked, I'm grateful, I wrote a text for MoMA recently about Tongues Untied, where I talked about the central thesis of Tongues Untied, which is black men loving black men is the revolutionary act. That's the thesis, that's the stated thesis of Tongues Untied. It's a banner that men carry in the gay pride parade. And it's also a text that is at the beginning and at the end of that very important film. Black men loving black men is the underscored revolutionary act. At the time, to give you a sense of the structure of feeling, someone, who I won't say who, in the gay press called Marlon out, criticized Marlon for making that the thesis of his film, because it is known, or was known, that Marlon's lover was white. Now, how stupid is that? Black men loving black men is the revolutionary act is not about the limit of that critique. Black men loving black men is the revolutionary act was about love. It was about brotherhood. It was about sisterhood. It was about comradeship. It was about organizing. It had an expansive notion of love, which we can relate to because we hear people that we admire very much, like Fred Moten and Stefano Harney and other people, talking about the centrality of love at this moment. Bell Hooks. That was part of the structure of feeling of that moment. That was 1989. Marlon made that film. 1991, the Black Popular Studies Conference, Black Popular Culture Conference. That was really fascinating. I was 27. I was first introduced to critical race theory. I had become really close friends with Kendall Thomas, who eventually published an anthology of critical race theory, legal theorist, cultural theorist, cabaret artist, an activist. And I actually attended that conference with Kendall and Douglas Crimp and a whole bunch of people, friends of mine, who are still friends of mine. And that conference was a watershed for me because it was when I was first really grappling with the theoretical language to talk about intersectionality. And that conference was really interesting because we shouldn't necessarily look at that conference as it is a watershed moment. What I remember is that there was a lot of discussion, critique, internal and external. There was an external critique to be made about the way that black popular culture was hijacked by capitalism, by white people. There was a discussion going on at the time because it was postmodernism about high and low, the relationship of popular culture to art culture, which is something perhaps we've defeated or not defeated. I don't know if we've defeated the distinction between high and low. So there was an external critique also about the lack of inclusion of people of color in our art institutions, in our academic institutions. There was a gathering, an ingathering of black intellectuals discussing among and between themselves in public, which was a remarkable event. But there was a lot of dissension among the people. I remember that the black feminists were talking about a critique of black macho and the representation of black macho and machismo in popular culture. And black queer people, like Marlon, were talking about how homophobia outside and within the black community affected queer people and people with AIDS. There was a deep conversation going on there that had to be had, that it was absolutely necessary. But we have to remember that actually it was a contentious and truly interesting set of debates that were marked by difference, internal difference and disagreement. That was the structure of feeling. Then there's Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall, as part of that conference, Lester, correct me if I'm wrong, Stuart Hall, as part of that conference, spoke at the Studio Museum, right? Stuart Hall said, go forward without guarantees of essentialism. He told us all, it was like marching orders, go forward without the guarantees of essentialism. And I took that in, I took that to heart, and I proceeded under that banner and have continued to proceed under that presumption. But I think it's really interesting, and one of the challenges we face is that that was produced out of the structures of feeling of that moment. And the structures of feeling of this moment, which is very hard to describe, and because it's happening right now, necessitates different utterances that we made, but not in the same words. So, Black Lives Matter, or as Fred Moten talks about, Black Life Matters. There's a discussion now of ontology, which is different than the discussion on essentialism, that marks the difference between this moment and that moment, with an emphasis on life and the specificity of life among a great variation of differences. Oh, there was something I did want to say. I can't see you. I could do this for a long time. I like the mic. I'm like this, but I'll just indulge me just for a couple more minutes. There was a few scattered things I left out there that I think are important. Is that all right? I'm looking at Lyle. Because I was told to say something about AIDS. And the reason why I can't get beyond nostalgia and melancholy, and why I have elevated depression to a form of style, is because I'm 53 and I've had HIV longer than I have not. I tested positive when I was 23. For many of us, the AIDS crisis is not over. For me, it's impossible. Marlon was my friend. Marlon and I showed films together. Essex and I read together. I got a postcard from Essex that just said, "Dear Greg, protect your talents, XO, Essex." And I still wonder, am I living up to that? Did I live up to that, Essex? These people aren't gone. And so for me, this is, the Ektachrome project is both mourning and joy. Like I look at it, and it's, you know, I'm in mourning. I always look to see who's still around and I'm very conscious of that. And yet joy, because there's Marlon. There's Essex. There they are. Then there's tons of other people who are not in the pictures, but who I think of, like groups. Another group that met, that was tremendously important to me in the Lesbian Gay Center, who still meets there, is other countries, the poets of other countries. Craig Harris, Donald Woods, Dave Frechette. I'm getting, you know, kind of new agey, I guess, in my old age. I believe in time symmetry. It's like, you can get that from physics, you can get it from religion, you know, that the past is mutable and the future is predetermined. And they're reversible. I live in a time-symmetric space. That's the space of survival. I'll end there. Thank you.
That was very powerful. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Lyle, for inviting me to be here. Lyle had invited me to write for the book, and I was very, very honored. And so I couldn't help, when I was looking through the archive, trying to find an image that I could connect with. And so one of the images, which will come up here on the slide presentation, that I really connected with was the photograph of Gail and Peggy, Fort Greene, Brooklyn, New York, late 1980s. I chose that photograph mainly because it was what I think appear to be two queer women in Fort Greene in the late 80s, and I live in Fort Greene. And so I wanted to find a personal connection with myself as a queer woman living in Fort Greene. So I'll just read what I wrote in the book. It's a very small essay. And when I was thinking of what I would write about the photograph, I wanted to think about a quote that represented to me what I thought of Lyle and how I see Lyle as a mentor and friend and one of my chosen family. So I'll start there. Begins, quote, "The precise role of the artist then is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads, through vast forests, so that we will not in our own doing lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place." End quote, James Baldwin. So I begin with my essay about the photograph, Gail and Peggy, Fort Greene, Brooklyn, New York, late 1980s. I moved to Fort Greene in my 20s in 1995 to attend Pratt Institute. 15 years after Lyle Ashton Harris shot this photograph of Gail and Peggy, who I imagine were themselves in their 20s at the time. Fort Greene in the 1980s was dealing with the ravages of crack epidemic. Drugs were a major issue across America. At the time, my own mother had her battles with drug addiction. When I arrived in Fort Greene, it was near the end of the epidemic, the slow beginning of gentrification. Like Gail and Peggy, if one generation younger, I was Black and queer in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. From the moment I saw them in this picture, it was as though I knew these young women, Gail and Peggy, 20-somethings, now 3.5 decades on. They look similar to other members of my, quote, chosen family, the lesbian, gay, boy, genderqueer, bisexual, transsexual, questioning, intersex, two-spirit family members that are woven together in order to create a safe environment for growth and love without limits. This photograph reflects in a deep way and calls upon that community for me. It embodies a place that has that has had a major, impact on my life, that taught me how to love and challenge me. There are many of these stories. Some are told in books like Audre Lorde's Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name, which demonstrates the significance of chosen family in the queerest character's life. But it is that familiarity of comfort and family dynamics that this photo conjures. They are feelings that I want to hold on to. Our spirits feel kindred, Gail and Peggy. Depicted here, facing the viewer, I see you questioning the photograph. Are you lovers sitting in a room, one in front of a purple curtain composed in a red turtleneck shirt, holding a cigarette, the other, stud, gender fluid, boy, hands and hair, blue silk robe, raw and visceral. Lyle captures, for me, the reality of these roles in a manner so true to the moment. They are lovers or friends, sister outsiders, preparing to go out or stay at home, who knows? These are photos of real people in their mundane daily activities, but they represent in the intersection of art and exemplify queer life in the act, depicting the social climate of that particular time and space. The inclusiveness of both their gazes provides comfort and gives voice to queer bodies, my queer body, our queer bodies. The beauty of Gail and Peggy is that it harbors a sense of responsibility to reimagine and represent Lyle's world through his work as it plays with representations and perceptions of Black transgressivity and intersectionality. This photograph's myths and its embedded notions of raw and real life capture race and gender in a single moment. It is richly layered, giving the viewer permission to enter this bold, diaristic photograph with a queer lens. Thank you, Lyle.
Thank you, Lyle, again. I'm going to play a song that Lyle performed when he first shared the archive with the public at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago. And I watched Lyle talk about his work with the sound of Grace Jones behind him, who is the best accompanist you can ask for. So I would like to play the song that he so effortlessly worked with. This is Walking in the Rain.
Thank you. I'm so deeply honored. Thank you. So, that's it. Thank you.